Horror games are kinda cool when they're done well. We've seen plenty of excellent examples, such as Zomboid, Resident Evil, Outlast, and many more that have utilized combinations of other horror media to produce an outstanding yet unforgettable experience in gaming history. Dino Crisis, for those of you who remember, was a pretty damn solid combination of dinosaurs and modern-day analog horror way before those shitty animations overtook YouTube. I really like the concept of putting dinosaurs in a first-person oriented horror game, but it's not common that devs lean into this idea, and usually when they do, the game comes off as, well, let's just say boring and uninteresting. You're not gonna believe this, but there was an indie game made almost 10 years ago that a lot of people seem to have forgotten about, myself included. It wasn't until the other day when I was browsing a few forums on Reddit and rediscovered the absolute gem that I'm covering today. 1916 was an indie game that took the internet by storm when Markiplier and other YouTubers played it on the platform, spiking its popularity and instantly granting it overwhelming praise. Before Amnesia's The Bunker, we had this, and boy, was it memorable. The underrated indie horror gem that I'm covering isn't as deep as others I've talked about, but since it's been such a long time, I figured I'd better reflect on it while I have this chance. After all, I'm sure other indie games have this one to thank for inspiring lots of great mechanics for future scary games. 1916 is the short story of a young soldier navigating the trenches in a desperate attempt to escape. The player is put directly in the shoes of this poor bastard as he encounters dead bodies of his fallen comrades, nearby explosions that can distract and disorient you, and worst of all, the fucking velociraptors. Yeah, I guess the big secret's out now. The main threat in this outstanding game is none other than some sort of cybernetic velociraptor creation with pale white eyes and sharpened teeth. Their insatiable hunger knows no bounds. These creatures are essentially what interested me so much in it as a whole. It's not often we see dinosaurs incorporated into horror games, let alone good ones. However, this time I feel like they really hit the mark. It's a very simple idea created by a small amateur team, but holy shit, it's so impressive you really forget after a little while that it's not a mainstream title. What a great concept. Being forced to run through decaying swamps of death as the monstrous prehistoric nightmares try effortlessly to hunt you down. Horror games that utilize this style of having a stalker enemy can be riveting and offer some rewarding gameplay for any story seekers out there. Unfortunately, the lore is extremely interesting with its main enemy, but unless you can read or speak German, you won't be able to understand your objective. It sucks because I could just run all of these documents word for word in a translator, but that kind of defeats the point of the mystery today. This game is 10 fucking years old, and sadly I don't think it's getting a sequel. Besides those couple things, I can absolutely compliment everything else. The gameplay? Intense. The stalkers? Terrifying. Pants? Shat. Trust me when I say that even though it's wicked short, 1916 delivers an explosive, impactful punch in the genre even after all this time. Thanks to its unique mechanics, there are a few things you can expect that you might have never seen before, so let's get into it together and see how we feel. The basics go like this. You walk pretty slow, but can sprint at insanely fast speeds. To some, this is necessary and must be completed in order to fully escape the threat in horror games. To me, this game's version of a sprint mechanic is actually interesting if you choose to pick it apart. While you do have the option of running away from danger, sprinting will cause the camera to shake like a Neil Blomkamp film. This can disorient and confuse you at times, which makes sense. In the heat of the moment, you're not expecting to come across a cybernetic velociraptor in your daily fucking life, so if one had to run away from that, I'd imagine it would look something like this. You're panicked when you're scared, so it makes sense that running away would cause the camera a lot of stress from this perspective. How do you combat the raptors? Isn't there a way to stop them? Oh, you arrogant, stupid fools. No. This is a true test to your patience and anxiety levels because it makes for a surprisingly difficult yet fun obstacle course that any horror game enthusiast could praise. You get the option of slowing them down, albeit temporarily. You can collect flares throughout the trenches which blind the prehistoric pricks for a moment, granting you some leeway. You can, at any time, check how many supplies you have simply by looking down at your feet. This was pretty cool for an indie game. Imagine having something like this in Resident Evil 7. Being able to check Ethan's waistband for some bullets would have certainly added to the realism, though it wasn't necessary. It's just a neat idea. Dead bodies aren't just decor, they are gold mines for throwable body parts that can distract the raptors and occupy their minds for a brief period of time. You can even scatter said limbs throughout random places in the trench, and they'll eventually come across it and stop dead in their tracks to eat it. There's no crouching or slow stealthy movement, you're forced to keep up the pace and find a way out. A clever mechanic that I can respect because no true horror game is effective unless it genuinely gives you at least a couple of spook-filled moments. Except the entire game is taking place not only during a war, but in a claustrophobic and unfamiliar land with 3 fucking dinosaurs hunting you down. Thankfully, the map itself isn't randomly generated, though I could see a mod doing that someday. It's not too difficult to memorize where you're going, but the problem is the raptors. There are 2 of the fucking assholes at the beginning, which already makes for a difficult time navigating the trench and learning which signposts lead to where. Yeah, the signposts are really your only bet against escaping. If you come across the bunker, get your slow, stupid ass inside as fast as possible. Otherwise, you'll just be a raptor snack. Inside the bunker, you'll find a rifle. Don't get too cocky. Ammo is extremely limited and bullets are fired one at a time. There's no crosshair, no clear indication of hitting your mark, nothing. I personally would only use the rifle as a last resort type thing, as it's not a guarantee against the dinosaurs. I personally wasn't able to hit them, so I just used flares and ripped limbs from dead bodies. Those are always effective and will grant you some time to get away, which is ultimately what the entire game's about anyway. One clever way of distracting the player happens at random, but it's always effective. Sometimes you'll be running and an explosion nearby will cause you to panic for a brief moment, which has messed with my directions while traversing the rotten maze. It also genuinely gets a good jump scare out of you, something horror games don't do often today. You can take up to 3 bites from a dinosaur before you die, depending on where they hit you. I was killed instantly with my back turned on one of my runs, so I would suggest finding the bunker. It's pretty much on the far right side of the map and can be accessed without a key. There's also a map inside that I had to take a picture of to memorize. The goal is to find the ladder and escape, and if I'm going back outside, I want to know what the fuck I have to do and where I have to go. So, you have to find a gas mask. This will allow you to access areas filled with toxic chemicals and get you to the end game. The gas mask is located on the corpse of another soldier. Alongside him are a couple of flares and bullets. If you follow the sign that reads Varat, you'll find the mask. But be careful. Once you obtain it, the 3rd velociraptor will spawn nearby, instantly aggroed on your position. Now you have to find the ladder. It took me a couple of tries, I'll admit, but that's kind of the point of games like this. I have a fond memory of playing 1916 in my computer class while a few spectators watched in anticipation. It was pretty ethereal at the time to play a video game at school, but we found a way to work around the website blocks, and soon enough, us kids were playing Slenderman and SCP on Macintosh school computers. Damn. Back then, beating this game made you immortal. It was like getting a high score in Flappy Bird or winning the lottery. If you could beat the game, you were cool, plain and simple. Of course, I struggled a lot and only ever completed the game once during my youth. After all this time, I'm proud to say that despite the challenge, I overcame the obstacles and beat the game again, though it's very intense. Wearing the mask limits your vision, so it can be stupid easy to get turned around and run in the wrong direction here. Once you break from the gas cloud, you're free to take the mask off for better vision. And don't let anything distract you, because even one flaw could be the end of a great run. Just head for the ladder and don't look back. I had an extremely close call because one of the raptors will teleport behind you instantly the second you see the ladder. I almost died right there until I quickly turned around and escaped the trench. Your character sprints away from the turmoil and destruction around him, only to be greeted by another raptor that ambushes you. Just like a classic horror game, you're booted back to the main menu upon completion. No rewards, no congrats, no nothing. You've met your fate, and the game is over. In my opinion, this concept is criminally underrated. Can you imagine a remake of 1916 by today's standards? That's something that would turn my underwear inside out on the spot. I can foresee a remake of this gem with an updated and lengthened storyline, some deep analysis of the creatures and their designs, while maintaining that black and white retro filter. It all just helps to sell the horror inside along with the time period that it took place. I like the idea of having to check your inventory simply by looking down at your belt instead of pressing a key. It helps amplify that immersion feeling, knowing the physical amount of supplies you have must be monitored at all times. The field of view is very low and the camera shake is stomach turning, which is exactly how it must have felt to navigate these trenches in the first place. There's a haunted house effect at play in the trenches, which comes off as a bit silly now, but when we first played this game, we hadn't had a concept like this in the horror genre before. Most of the time it was jump scares and unnecessary long-winded walking simulators. Now all of a sudden, this little game comes along and ups the ante. It's not about the scare anymore. It's the anxiety of being chased by an almost invincible threat. I'm not saying this was the first horror game to ever do that, but I feel like it is an underrated entry of the genre. It's like the perfect fucking recipe. Put dinosaurs in a more horrific and uncontrollable setting alongside humans, and you can create all kinds of outstanding things. Why don't more devs do this? Though I can't read them, I really appreciate the fact that notes are added to the game's lore despite being such a short story. The developer said in the description that he kept the entire game in German as to remain respectful of the time period, which I too can respect. Unfortunately, there isn't much reason to replay the game after completion unless you just really like the overall concept. It sucks. For what it's worth, the game might be old, but in my opinion it really deserves another chance. This game reminds me a lot of Amnesia the Bunker, though it's a lot more primitive, which works well in the pacing and overall feel. In a war, it's a losing game for everyone, but add cybernetic dinosaurs into the fucking mix and suddenly it's an all-out apocalypse. And I love that concept so much. Why can't we get more dino horror games in this era? I was born in the wrong goddamn timeline, I think. Either way, 1916 is one of my favorite horror games. Even though it has such a simplistic style to it, I'd like to think it's a classic. I would hope lots of you would remember this game, and if you don't, I highly recommend you try it out. It's roughly a half hour to an hour long experience, mostly because it takes a bit of time to memorize the trenches and understand the objective. It's not just the concept of the game that makes it so iconic to me, it's also the design, the graphics, the map, the setting. These are all different concoctions that come together to form a horror masterpiece. I can only hope that somewhere the developer is still working hard and making great games. It's a stylistic and horrifying game with just the right amount of stuff in it to make it good. I was really happy to replay it flawlessly after all this time, as it brought me back to my middle school days and reminded me that indie games can be pretty damn good at times, no matter how big or small. If a remake of this game were announced on Steam or something, I'd 100% invest my time and money into it. I know it's very unlikely, seeing as how this game is 10 years old now, but let's not forget that these gems ever existed. All we can do now is look back on games like 1916, play them, and hope it might make a return. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you next time.